good to be alive in this land of ours. Good to drive in this land of ours.
Hello, Canada hockey fans in the United States.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hockey Time Machine. I'm Glenn Dreyfus. For the most heated competition in pro sports, you can't buy a ticket. You can't watch it on TV. You can't listen to it on the radio. In fact, the full impact of the results of that competition, sometimes they aren't fully known until months or even years after the fact. We're talking about the competition known as labor management negotiations. And there's no better person to shed light on this topic than Gerry Meehan, who played a decade in the NHL, got his law license, served as general manager of the Sabres, and is now a sports consultant. In our last show, Gerry took us through the early history of labor management relations in the NHL. Tonight, we're talking lockouts, expansion, the salary cap, name, image, and likeness. And maybe we could even coax Gerry into dusting off his crystal ball to give us a glimpse into the future of players versus owners. So here is Gerry Meehan. Thank you very much for joining us, Gerry.
Thanks, Glenn. Always good to be with you. Good to be here.
Let's begin with a quote from the Marquette University Sports Law Review, my favorite light reading. Quote, from the mid-1990s, labor relations between the two parties had been rather strained, leading to the first strike in the history of professional hockey in 1992. So first, Gerry, if you would, give us a sense of what led up to that strike in 92 and how both sides fared in the aftermath.
Well, the 92 strike was precipitated, I believe, as a statement by the new leadership of the NHL Players Association that things were going to be different going forward in terms of labor relations and the direct connection between the league, the owners, and the union. We would call it an association, but in fact it was a union. I think the 92 strike was basically a shot across the bow. It was settled, I believe, in a very quick time, and I do believe that at that time, two particularly important members of the union and great players, Wayne Gretzky and Mario Lemieux, I think, partially brokered the solution to it, whatever that may have been, in order to keep the season going. It was done late in the season. It was meant to disrupt the status quo, and it worked because I think it sent an alarm bell through the ownership and the hockey management group that what had been characteristic of the relationships preceding that was over, and it was a new era dawning on labor negotiations for the NHL.
2 years later, the NHL players are locked out by the owners. So first, if you would, give us the distinction between a lockout and a strike.
Well, they're the same principle, but initiated by different parties. A lockout was initiated by the ownership group. A strike is usually initiated by the union, and it's almost always surrounding the time within which they want to start negotiating a new labor agreement or a new labor agreement has expired. We could get real technical, but I don't think we should at this point, because both of them are attached to certain legal requirements under U.S. and Canadian law, labor law, and antitrust law that get very complex. But the idea behind the strike is basically the union says we're not playing, and Alaka is the owner says we're not going to employ you nor play the games until you come to the table and make a deal.
And what was the reasoning behind the 94-95 lockout, and how was it different from what the players were trying to get done in 92?
I think you could say organically it was a similar approach. The ownership and the management of the National Hockey League was sending a message to the Players Association and its leader, Bob Goodnow, that we are not going to soft pedal this. This is going to be hard and fast negotiations, and we're not going to play in the games until you come to the table to discuss some very serious issues, which involve, I guess we could say, cost certainty at this stage. Maybe it was a little early for that. But the fact is that teams were bleeding money because the players were making dollars, in some cases, far beyond most of the team's ability to make any kind of profit out of their activities. And you say no profit to most free enterprise business owners is like, well, we're not going to play under those circumstances. So it was probably the league coming back and saying, okay, let's get serious. They're serious. We're heading for a long process. And as we all know now, looking back on the history of labor negotiations in sports, it takes a long time for teams, leagues, and players to come to an adequate resolution of those very, very serious problems that usually involve money.
Before we get to that disastrous second lockout in 2004, you mentioned the players getting, in the owner's view, too much money, and sometimes cost certainty is derisively described as saving the owners from themselves. Were the owners or the managers operating under the owners, didn't they have control over how much they paid the players?
Yes and no. Well, the reality is that in a perfect world of that's balanced between the two, and given the fact that it's a competitive business in which teams are aspiring to be winners and will win the ultimate prize of the Stanley Cup, it's very hard to restrain salaries where it cannot be restrained objectively by a system, because clubs will spend money to acquire players that they may not be able to afford under the premise or the thought that, well, we'll get this player, pay him a lot of money even though we can't afford him, and then we'll win the cup, and then we'll justify it all because we'll sell more tickets next year. That's one of the thoughts. But I think it's just a part of the whole idea of you can take a loss for a short term as long as you have a sense that the profits will come later. But it got really serious where I think the players' salaries represent something in the neighborhood of 74 to 75% of league revenues. And under any circumstances, when you take that and add in the expenses of running a team and a farm system and paying all your people, not on the ice, but to support the efforts of the players on the ice, running a money pro system, you are not going to make money unless you're a big market team. And the big issue was big market teams could probably survive in any economic system, but the majority of the teams in the league could not operate profitably in a system that didn't have some level of salary restraint.
I am speaking way out of my depth, so feel free to correct me of misconceptions here. But isn't it also very tangled about whether sports franchises and leagues are actually profitable, actually making money, actually losing money? Because there's so much involved in making that determination and what you count and what you don't, and whether you consider what a franchise is worth when you sell it, and media and ancillary rights and so on. And my feeling is that much like Hollywood movies, can't you kind of make the books say anything you want them to?
Well, that may be a little bit oversimplification, but the reality
That's
is
me. I'm all about oversimplification.
Yeah. But the reality is that you could build a corporate structure in which you might own an arena and might run a facility for other events and use the arena as the basis for a profit for an overall enterprise that included but was not limited to a hockey team. But if you came right down to it, if as a business function, each entity in a corporate unit, whether it be concessions or parking or whatever, stands alone as a business, a separate operating entity. So the goal is to have each of your operating entities be profitable, or else they're leeching money out of the other enterprises that might be making money, but only because you're playing games in that arena or hosting events. So I think you could argue that, yes, there were ways that you could make it look like you were losing money, but the larger enterprise was being profitable. But I don't think that's fair, because every entity within a business structure, and a lot of teams didn't have the luxury of a large corporate entity backing them. A lot of them were just small city individual enterprises renting from the city. Landlord-tenant relationships cost them rent, and their hockey team was their sole opportunity to have a profitable business enterprise. And community commitment only goes so far, and before long, community commitment at the cost of several million a year becomes very unattractive as a business operation. So I think you could argue that there's ways to structure teams that could protect the profitability of the overall enterprise by paying a little bit more for the hockey operation than you might, but that's very uncommon and only meets the needs of a very small group of teams in those days.
Let's move ahead to 2004 and the second lockout, which led to the cancellation of the entire hockey season, including the playoffs, which was a first in sports in North America. So to quote that great negotiator, Vito Corleone, how did things ever get this far?
Well, I just think that when the players union became more confrontational or oppositional after the end of the Eagleson era, when Bob Goodenow took over as the leader, the relationship between the league and the union became less cooperative, more combative, as probably it should have been. And I think the ultimate outcome of the 2004-5 lockout was premised upon a series of events that led to this ultimate confrontation that was focused upon cost certainty, revenue sharing, and making sure that there was a responsible balance, economic balance between players and the management or ownership of the teams in the league that makes sure that everybody would get a fair share of the pie. Now, the way it was done, obviously, was because they created what was called hockey-related revenues. And this was a huge matter of negotiation, because hockey-related revenues in the old days when we had these multiple layers of corporate enterprise, hockey-related revenues might have been not included because the concessions might have been owned by another company within the umbrella of the main parent. Where this negotiation came about because that was recognized as a bit of a bad habit or an injury to the players, because they weren't getting credit for some of the money that they were generating from their efforts. So that dragged into the calculation of the player's share all of these other ancillary revenues that were related to the performance of the players.
As you mentioned, the second lockout led to the signing of a collective bargaining agreement. Can you give us some more detail and get into the weeds a little bit on the CBA and how that has affected hockey and how it's different from what was there before?
Well, before 1967, there was really no collective bargaining in the National Hockey League. In 1967, they signed the first agreement, I think, with Al Eagleson as the leader. I believe it was 67. And that was basically, that agreement recognized the association as a union subject to the labor laws and all the other things that apply to operating as pro sports leagues. And most importantly, it recognized the union as the bargaining representative for players collectively in all aspects of their career, conditions of employment, etc., except for their individual salaries, which was the uniqueness between a union in sports and a union in the industries, which is the individual negotiation of contract values for individual employees. From that, it became a process which followed the kind of the lead and the example of other leagues. The death of the reserve clause, salary disclosure, moving towards these different activities through lockouts and strikes led to a system that was basically meant to be done in a more encapsulated way earlier, but it takes time and persuasion to get through it, as they ultimately did. But the goal of the 2004-2005 collective agreement was basically cost certainty, salary caps, cost certainty, revenue sharing, and a fair share of the revenues between the teams and the players.
Now that we're 20 years beyond the lockout of 2004, I don't know whether that lockout was necessary to forge this new kind of agreement, but is there any possibility that it was a necessary evil, as unpleasant as it all was, to get us to a place where the sport could be sustained for decades to come?
Well, we can give credit, I think, to the league for standing up for the principle that we've got to stop this progress by inches, and we've got to create a system that works for everybody. Now, one of the things that's come out of that last group of oppositional bargaining has been a great benefit for the large market teams, because they're now restrained in terms of their ability to spend money on player contracts, but they also are not restrained on how much money they can make in a large market. But more importantly, it creates a revenue sharing system that allows other franchises that are operating outside of the large market team culture, I guess, or environment, to be able to operate rationally in a system that requires them to spend a certain amount of money, no less than, on player salaries. And if they've done that, they meet a standard by which they can receive a revenue share from a pot that's shared by the entire league, or not shared by the entire league, but contributed to by the entire league. So it creates not only the opportunity for the large market teams to do well economically, but also protects the small market teams from not going into debt, as long as they promise to continue to perform their services within the confines of the cap. Excuse me.
Of the CBA, the Marquette University Sports Law Review said, quote, "It's a labor relations system that is quite novel since it was set up outside of existing labor laws." So is that your understanding as well? And if it is, how is that possible?
I don't know what that means. Can you repeat that again? That's kind of confusing. I need my thesaurus.
The NHL CBA, according to the Marquette University Sports Law Review, this is how they described it: a labor relations system that is quite novel since it was set up outside of existing labor laws.
Well, I have to look at that very closely. I don't know that it could have been set up outside of existing labor laws. I mean, the whole point of collective bargaining is it's imposed by the labor law.
Well, that's what I get for reading.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I think that's taken in, and it might be a comment in out of context to what the larger point was. But to me, all of this was driven by two laws that override the entire situation: the antitrust laws, which were well established in the National Hockey League in the Sanderson and Cheevers cases, and the National Labor Relations Act and the Canadian Act laws that are similar. So I'd be hard pressed to make a comment in support of that unless I took a little closer look at it. But it seems to me that it has been the labor laws and the courts, or the threat of litigation, that has led to where we are today.
There are other factors I'd like to get into that have affected labor management relations. One of those is expansion. Since 1991, the league has added 11 teams. Yeah. I know one impact of that expansion is more jobs. and more teams in more cities. But what else do you see as the ramifications of the league expanding so enormously?
Really, this is a really interesting point, and I think we have to deal with it with a retrospective comment about the WHA. We talked about the World Hockey Association last time we were together, and the World Hockey Association was competing directly against the National Hockey League, but also what it was doing, it was occupying or taking up markets that the National Hockey League was not already in. And one of the goals, I think, of the merger was not just to eliminate the rival league and its challenge for your player talent, but also to eliminate a rival league's ability to compete with you in new markets. So that led to the idea that we're going to go to new markets to make sure that we eat up all the other great opportunities. Also within the ethic of saying we got to grow this great game in the United States. And as we know, most of the expansion came in the United States. So that was a real backdrop to me.
And with the expansion, the game has grown. I remember one of the reasons for the 1967 expansion was to interest U.S. television. It seems like the results have been nationally in the United States that U.S. television is more interested than ever in the National Hockey League. Has that been one of the outgrowths of placing the NHL?
I think it's a valid comment. I think that's a very valid comment. A big part of it was TV, but also think of today as the additional content deliverable opportunities, streaming, other different networks that come into it. You've got all kinds of different places to sell the product, not just in the local markets or in a national network deal. We've got Disney, we've got ESPN, we've got TNT involved, not to mention NHL.com. So the first place you go with your team is to deliver the message through a local audience that needs a team in that locality. But when we think of the local audience, it's not just the million or two people in your city or your region. It's beyond that. And they all want access to the games. And along with that has come the improvement in the skill level of the game, which has dramatically changed it. So now you've got opportunities for people not only to see the games live, they can see them on their TV screens at home. They can see them on their devices. They can see them on their laptops. And they've got all kinds of opportunity. And in today's sports market, the world is looking for more content. So it's kind of like a perfect storm of contingencies all coming together at once. But there's no question it started with the expansion and creating a footprint in these markets that didn't have familiarity with the game of hockey, which are now hockey strongholds.
I'm going a little bit far afield, but it occurs to me that establishing more of a footprint and combined with the enormous dollars that are involved these days actually might have priced Canadian cities out of the running for teams, even with hockey rabid fan bases in a Quebec, in a Hamilton, other places in Canada. You know, maybe Winnipeg got back in just under the wire, but are places in Canada perhaps casualties of the new economics?
It's an interesting question, Glenn. When I was first came out of my playing career and out of law school, one of my first jobs was to assess, under the supervision of Bob Swados, who was the Sabres counsel, was to assess the likelihood of Hamilton becoming an NHL city at the same time as we were trying to build a new arena or get a new arena project underway conceptually in Buffalo. And at that time, the idea was that the market is basically the in-arena audience and the fans in the immediate locale to go to games, buy hot dogs and beers and park and pay that. And the TV market and the other deliverable markets other than live audiences was secondary. The reality now is that the large markets dominate. And when I mean large markets, I'm not just talking about a city alone. I'm talking about the whole economic impact of a team in a region. And complicated with that is the Hamilton situation sits within the Leafs franchise rights and abuts a little bit the Sabres. So that was always problematic. And you would think that a city like Quebec City, which was so successful before they had an arena, would be a natural. And I'm sure it's under people's consideration all the time, but the reality is the market really is the large market for the audience is in the United States. And when you look at the Canadian cities, Vancouver has a team, Calgary has a team, Winnipeg has a team, Toronto, Montreal have teams. What are left that satisfy not only the audience needs to attend games and the revenues attached to that, but also the broader market base that's regionally allocated, and it's not to the same degree. You talk about an Atlanta, which has failed twice, but it still has a market reach of many times more than Quebec. It's not a national hockey, but it's the balance between live event revenue versus the opportunity to influence the entire market with multiple streams of information about the team and their playing games and so on. So I think it's a challenge. I mean, I see Quebec as would be a very viable franchise, but I'm not so sure that with the 32 team league, that's in the immediate future. But the league and they seem to be committed to the franchises that are currently in the United States and building them and growing the marketplace there. So you can't blame them for that. That's where the people are.
We've also seen a transition in ownership. And when I think about Atlanta and some other franchises, it isn't just a matter of having money. It's also maybe about having people who understand the sport and understand the marketing of the sport, because the game has certainly worked in quote unquote non-traditional markets. In Tampa,
Right.
It's certainly worked. So, and we've also transitioned over the decades from the single owners, the Bill Wirtz and the Harold Ballards and the A. Polans and so on, to more corporate ownership. Is that basically a trend for the better? We've moved away from owners who maybe, like people who own media companies, that they were prestige items and maybe even loss leaders, to now you have to make money, but you still have to understand the sport at the same time. And sometimes those things are at odds. So take out of all of that what you want and comment what you want on that.
Well, it's really an interesting topic, and we could go in a lot of different directions. Number one, I think now where hockey ownership was more traditional a number of years ago, you had people who had been families of people who had been in the game for generations. The Wirtzes, the Norrises, the Knoxes who came into Buffalo. Most of these companies, they were very much businessmen, but they also viewed it as a community asset. And I think that today we've got more in the nature of very wealthy men and women who buy teams because they can afford to pay a lot of money for them. And it's a fun project, and in some cases it might fit their business model. I can't give an example. But there's only so many sports franchises available. And we look at the growth in value. It never used to be thought of as an investable asset. It was thought of as an operating company. But now you look at the growth and the value of these franchises. Wealthy people who can afford to buy teams at the $500 million plus amount are probably guaranteed never to lose money in the long run based upon increase in value of franchises, because they're not generally available. And the other thing about ownership today, I think, is most of the owners, especially the new ones coming in, are either very, very wealthy individuals or companies with wealthy individuals that own them, who build them into their own corporate empires. So it's a whole different economic value. We're now dealing with people who are investing in franchises for the purpose of making a real business out of them and turning them into part of their corporate empire. And they're not just doing that out of the goodwill of creating a community asset.
I think something that also has changed with the enormous amounts of money that it costs to enter the league, $500 million for the Vegas Golden Knights, $650 million for the Seattle Kraken, versus the
Yeah.
2 million to 6 million that the California Seals and the Pittsburgh Penguins and the Capitals and the Scouts, is that the league and the fellow owners are giving better prenatal care to these newer franchises. I did some research that the teams that entered in the 60s and 70s, a lot of them never even ended up paying their full entry fees. They were forgiven half or more than their entry fees because they had no way to pay them. And that was partly due to the fact, well, the WHA was one factor, the rating of the drafts was another, and also the fact that the existing teams weren't willing to give up any players that were worth a damn. So there's better prenatal care now. So the newer franchises at least are getting a running start for the enormous amount of money they're paying.
Well, I can only imagine the meetings that they might have had. I wasn't at them, but just kind of positing a thought for a moment. The idea that when an expansion team was created and the dialogue would go something like this: we have a choice. We can sell this franchise to this gentleman for $600 million, up towards maybe $1 billion now for some teams, and give them some assets to have a competitive team, because in the long run that's worth it. Or we cannot have them as owners, because if you don't want to give them decent players, they're not going to buy this team. So the league leadership, basically I think led the dialogue in saying we cannot go do the Washington Capitals, Atlanta Flames, Buffalo Sabres. Well, the Buffalo Sabres are different because it was fewer teams then. But when the team started the league started to grow beyond the second expansion, some of those teams were put together on the basis of do your best, but you're not going to be any good for probably 5 to 8 years. That doesn't work in today's game. I mean, it took how long for the Washington Capitals? You're a Capitals guy, Glenn. How long did it take for the Capitals to go from really bad to competitive to a contender? It was a dozen years.
9 years. I mean,
yeah.
They entered the league in 74. They didn't make the playoffs till 83.
And I played for the Capitals from 76 to 79. And it was a team that had gone from being really bad to competitive enough to be respectable. But there were still some holes, and it wasn't going to be a playoff team until beyond that. And today that's not acceptable to a man, a family, or a man and a woman, the Gulas, for example, who are buying a team and saying, well, I'm going to spend $500 million. What am I going to get for this? I don't want to have to be sitting on a 2-25 record at Christmas with my team. The fans will never come to the games.
Well, and the part of this that doesn't get told is the NHL owners cost themselves tens of millions of dollars in 1970s money by having to forgive the expansion fees that they couldn't extract from the expansion teams because the expansion teams were so bad they were losing money.
Well, the other side of that coin is if you demand payment where somebody can't pay, it's called Chapter 11.
Yeah.
It didn't need a bunch of Chapter 11s in the league. So I mean, it was the right thing to do at the time. I think the process of expansion was inevitable, important, and very defensible for whatever reason it was done. It's a great game. It needs to be seen by more people. And at some point you say, well, okay, we tried that, but what are we going to do? We're going to shut the league down. If somebody pay us $500,000, we'll support them. I mean, the league carried the Sabres for what, 2 or 3 seasons when it was in a Chapter 11 situation. That's a bad lesson. And I think that probably was part of the reason why they won't go back to that, because they realized this is a bad situation. a classic franchise in bankruptcy. It just doesn't play.
They did that with the Seals. I think they did that with the
Right.
Penguins, maybe the Blues for a little while too. But my where my interest is not, I completely agree with you. The owners did the right thing by forgiving part of the entrance fees. Their mistake was crippling in my view, was
Yeah.
crippling the franchises to begin with, making them so weak that later on they would have to forgive the
An
entrance fee.
interesting comment there, I think, when the first expansion to the six teams was built around the premise that the original six teams had plenty of talent in their farm systems and they could give up enough players for the new teams to become successful. And then they did it again with Buffalo and Vancouver. They did it again with the Islanders and Atlanta. They did it again. The problem was the development system in hockey at the time was built around the 16 model. So to have enough development coming through the pipeline to replace players that were going to retire, get injured, whatever, and fill all the rosters hadn't caught up to the expansion level that was requiring them to be fed decent players. So there had to be a whole new growth pattern in hockey, which happened in the 70s and 80s and 90s when we saw hockey expand as a grassroots sports in the United States, Europe, and so on, because Canada, with its limited population, wasn't large enough to develop enough talent from the amateur ranks to fill 18, 19, 20, 25 NHL teams.
That's right. The U.S. was just getting started with really expanding its development programs. Players from Europe were just starting to trickle in, and there were the players behind the Iron Curtain. It was still 90% plus Canadian talent in the league back in the 70s. I saw a statistic with the AHL team of the Kraken that 40% of their players are U.S. born and 30% Canadian on the Coachella Valley Firebirds, just as one small example.
I did a study of this when I was working on that project. In the 1978, 79, 80 seasons, over 90% of the league's population was Canadian-bred hockey players. Today, it varies from year to year, but it's around 45%. And the other 55%, or 50%, depending on the particular year, is shared by Europe and the United States, with the United States producing about 60% of the non-Canadian content for talent in the league. Now, I may be off by a few percentage points, but you get the idea. Hockey has grown culturally and in the minds of the great young athletes that are coming out and want to play a sport and are good at it and want to maybe have a pro career. We all know that in the 50s and 60s in the United States, kids wanted to be probably a baseball player first, football player second, basketball player third, or some mix of that. And hockey was a non-entity, or not thought for. Anybody who played hockey in the United States was thought of by the Canadian attitude as not capable of being NHL level players. They were college guys that were probably going to get their degree and go on to the business world. That's all changed. And the talent pool is vast now. And it should be, because there's so many teams.
Back in 1993, NHL governors converted the position of their top administrator from president to commissioner. Gary Bettman was appointed, and 30 years later, he's still the only commissioner the league has ever had. It's an interesting position, sports commissioner, Jerry, because on one hand, they are expected to be stewards of the game. But on the other hand, we understand that they serve at the pleasure of the owners. So, without taking sides, how do we assess, if it's even possible to do, the 3 decades of the Gary Bettman era?
Well, the designation commissioner was a statement, and I believe it was a statement by the new administration that the leader of the league, the commissioner, president, whatever you might want to call it, whatever the name might be, does not preside over a collective group of owners and a board of governors where there's a persuasive attitude towards making decisions. I think the commissioner moniker says this is an office that operates independently in terms of developing strategy and planning for the league as a whole. That's not to say that the commissioner's office does not answer to the board of governors. Of course it does, and there's that element that says is there impartiality or not. But I think, the intention is that there becomes some level of impartiality in the commissioner's role. But at the end of the day, the commissioner is paid by the revenues of the National Hockey League and other sports similarly. But I think it's a designation that indicates a more strongly executive and leadership role than the old statement as president, which is presiding over a collective to come up with a collective decision. And it also indicates that the process of managing the business of hockey is done as an independent operation within a league commissioner's office structure, rather than under a committee system not be run by a board of governors.
So Bettman as an individual, it's unquestionable that he has presided over an absolute explosion in the game where it's played, as we pointed out, as you mentioned, the growth of the number of players, the number of teams, the number of jobs, the amount of money involved. And yet at the same time, there's no more certainty besides death and taxes than Gary Bettman producing the Stanley Cup, and when he's announced, he gets booed. So how is it that he's been in the job for 30 years and nobody stays in a job for 30 years anymore, and he's been so successful? Is anyone in that job automatically these days going to be unpopular?
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, I can guarantee you Gary doesn't get booed at the board of governors meetings. He's definitely done an amazing job, and he's got a great group of people around him. He's really brought in some great people. Bill Daly is a great deputy commissioner. I've had dealings with some other people; they're top notch, and I just think that he's a determined, well-trained, experienced guy, and has a great legal mind and the business sense that to do the right thing and to understand the nuances of each side. And the league has grown, and they've stayed the course and through many different bumps along the way, and they've always emerged from those bumps a better league and a better product on the ice. So I just think we have to recognize the commissioner's office and Gary have done just what was needed to bring the National Hockey League into the modern era.
Since you brought up Bill Daly, less is known about him than the commissioner. Why do you think that Bill is due for the praise that you've given him?
Bill is a very approachable guy, and the commissioner's office always has this bit of veneer to it, to being the area that not unapproachable, but above the fray and a little bit. Bill is in the fray, and he does a good job communicating to each side what the goals and objectives of the league are. And he's a perfect right-hand man. He just is well trained and schooled and ready for the challenge. I just think it's part of this commissioner's office that has good people doing good things at each level. So I mean, I can't tell you more than that, other than my feeling towards it. It's not based upon my recent community experiences, but I think Bill's done an amazing job being the face and the voice sometimes of league problems and league solutions that sometimes the commissioner can't or won't or doesn't want to communicate in a more mandatory fashion. He's a good balance.
The way you describe it makes me think almost, and I don't know how close this analogy is, the coach of a team and the assistant coach, where the assistant coach can sometimes be the conduit between the players and be the good cop, where the coach has to be the bad cop.
I think that's a fair assessment. There's not to say that Bill doesn't have his own point of where the buck stops. He certainly does know where it stops. But I think he's cast in that role. I wouldn't say intentionally, but by virtue of the circumstances of an ultimate leader having to be the face of the league and face of the game, and somebody at his side that can say, "Come on, let's go and have a coffee together and see if we work this out."
Across the table from the owners is the National Hockey League Players Association, NHLPA for short. Over the years, how well have they represented their membership? How well can they represent their membership?
Interesting. Good question. Lots of ways to answer it, I guess. I think that ultimately we have to look at the results of the relationship between the Players Association, the league, and where it's been and where it's come and where it is today. I think today the system is pretty well balanced. There's still some holes that need to be fixed. There's that whole escrow thing that's hanging around, and I'm not even sure what that is. But there's the idea that whether or not the cap is dealing effectively with the realities of the game. And I think what the union has given the players is a voice that allows them to express both their worst fears and their ultimate hopes for personal and league outcomes. And that process is healthy. It's also great now, I think, that it's now recognized as being part of a collective bargaining and legal process, because for a long time most pro sports were operated sort of like it as an ownership controlled clubhouse, and it needed this whole collective bargaining process to be revved up and energized and even become oppositional, because the tendency in everything in life is when you've got power, you extend it as far as you can. And without attributing any malintent to the ownership group, it's just a natural function of trying to control your outcomes as best you can. And it's my job to take care of my own, and it's your job to take care of your own. And if you can't do it, that's not my problem. I think the collective bargaining process has solved that myself. I clearly believe that, we look at this, we haven't seen any major work stoppages in pro sports other than since the last shutdown of the season in recent in the NHL. But in the last 10 or 12 years, almost all of the issues that have been faced by all the leagues have been settled by collective bargaining without work stoppages, strikes, or lockouts. So I think that's a testament. And when we had the renewal of the NHL CBA in 2020, I believe, that went out, with a whisper. There was almost no public displays of confrontation. It was a difficult time. We were doing the COVID thing and all that stuff, but basically, I think both sides have now recognized that it's time to cooperate, not fight.
I'd like to follow up on that, because the Owners and Players Association, in fact, are sometimes these days described as a partnership. And that's not how we normally think of adversaries. When the puck drops, the Maple Leafs and Canadians don't partner. So, two-part question. The current labor management dynamic, is it fair to say it's a partnership? And second part is, should it be a partnership?
Well, maybe partnership's the wrong word. I think partnership evokes the thought that we're in this together, and we agree on what we are both trying to achieve together. A partnership assumes that we've already figured out how we're going to be partners. I don't think that's the case in pro sports. There's always going to be tensions. I think what we've reached at is a what I call an equilibrium. In the 60s and 70s, the scale was balanced way too far in the favor of the owners. In the late 80s and 90s and early 2000s, it started to swing the other way. And I think it took a collective bargaining process to get the balance back in place. And if you view balance as a system that has a fair share of revenues, an opportunity for anybody that's invested in the business, whether it's player or owner, to make a reasonable profit from their efforts, and to provide, entertainment content that is satisfying the needs of the community. I think both sides now see the wisdom of that kind of approach. But will they ever be true partners in this legal sense of what a partnership means? Though there's still going to be, to some degree, a tension between the objectives of each side.
There is one group, one stakeholder, if you will, that you don't ever hear about in the labor management negotiations, the CBA negotiations, and that's the hockey operations people like team general managers. So the players certainly won't do this. Do the owners? Does it ever filter down questions during negotiations to the hockey ops people? Hey, if we alter the CBA this way, will this hamstring you, or how can we do this to make your job easier or better? Or is this a group that basically, once the players and the owners hammer it out, you have to make it work?
No, I think the general manager will always be involved. You'll notice that I don't know any team, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know any team that does not have the general manager as a member, an alternate member of the board of governors. The teams all have alternate governor memberships for their league council. Between the ownership, their team council, and the general manager, they're always in the loop in terms of what's going on. Now, where the communication or the day-to-day connection may break down is that the collective bargaining group is highly, organized around league initiatives and league management, and the reporting is probably more less direct on a daily basis with the board of governors than it might have been many years ago. But I do think that the general managers for sure are definitely involved. There is a competition committee, as I recall, and I think the competition committee includes both the members of the league staff, members of the board of governors, general managers, and in fact player members, so that there is a communication, a line of communication that's ongoing and constant. So I would say that from the general manager down below through the assistant general managers and scouts, they would be less involved, and the coach is rarely involved in the collective bargaining process. But definitely the general manager is in the loop, and in many cases might be even on the competition or negotiating committee. When I was doing my thing as the general manager, I was the chairman of the general managers committee, and my role on the negotiating committee is to make sure that all the general managers were in touch on plans and possible outcomes for the negotiations.
Let me raise one current micro example. The Kraken's #1 draft choice, Shane Wright. The choices that the team had with him, because he came from the OHA, was he could be placed on the major league roster or he could go back to junior. When the general manager, Ron Francis, what he really would have liked to do was to place the player in between in the American Hockey League, but for good reasons, the CBA doesn't allow that. And that's kind of the thing I was thinking of when I think, well, there are some rules that are put in place that a general manager just has to live with until he can get them changed.
Well, to be clear, that relationship or that obligation to keep the player or send him back to junior hockey is not a collectively bargained thing. It's part of the deal with the Canadian Hockey League. There's a pre-professional development committee, or there was, I don't know what it's called today, that negotiated the rights and obligations vis-a-vis the Canadian Hockey League, the three leagues, Quebec, Ontario, and the Western Hockey League. And part of that negotiation was that unless you had a player who was, the result of that negotiation was that any player who did not have at least 3 seasons, I think, completed of major junior hockey, if he was drafted, he could not be sent to the minor leagues. He had to go back to the junior leagues if he didn't make the NHL team. So that was really meant to protect the junior hockey operators. As you probably know, because there's been a junior team in Seattle for years, or there was, and Portland and other cities in the United States, Spokane, I think too. These teams are small community teams, and if you take their star player away from them at age 18 to turn them pro and keep them in the minors, it may be good for the NHL team, but it's disastrous for the junior teams. And it makes common sense. And frankly, in my view, an 18-year-old player, regardless of how good he is, except for the rare exception, does not belong either in the NHL or the AHL. They're not, although the AHL changed to some degree, it's now a development league, and maybe that's not fair. But they're not physically mature, they're not emotionally mature, and they're not ready for big league competition. And it would be a community disaster for junior hockey teams not to get their best players back if they weren't in the NHL.
For the record, in Canadian junior hockey, there are 8 franchises in the United States.
Right.
2 of them are in the Seattle area, one a little south of Seattle in a suburb, one in Everett a little bit north. And as you mentioned, there's also Portland and Spokane. There are a couple in Michigan
Right.
as well. There are some terms you've mentioned, Jerry, and I'd like to get a thumbnail description of them, if you would. You brought them up and explained them, but if you go a little bit deeper, one is cost certainty.
Yeah. Cost certainty is it relates to what I mentioned was the equilibrium. Sorry, the idea that when you start the season with it, or any business, you start with a budget, and the budget is based upon the idea that I'm anticipating this much revenue, and I'm anticipating this much expense. And after I subtract one from the other, I'm looking at this level of profitability or loss or whatever it might be. The problem with the lack of equilibrium stage was that there was never any sense of what the outcome would be at the end of the season, or maybe even at the end of several seasons, because you could not predict what you had to pay a player. And I remember negotiating contracts, and the owners would come to me and say, I need your budget for the salaries for the next season. And they asked me in June. And we hadn't even started the negotiating process yet. I said to Seymour and Northrop Knox, I said, well, I can give you a hope and a dream, but I can't give you anything to take to the bank on this, because we won't even know what the budgets are until we get through the summer, negotiating contracts, go to arbitration, who gets traded, who gets signed, all those kinds of things. So I said, I can give you a very loose ballpark, but you can't hold me to it. And I think that was the reality then. And we operated with a kind of a flexible budget in the sense we'd like it to be this, but we couldn't guarantee it. And if you make a trade during the season, you blow the budget if you're trying to win a Stanley Cup or make the playoffs or what might have been. So it was never an idea, at least in the small market mentality that we had, where we could actually predict outcomes, and mostly it depended on making the playoffs to even make a profit or stay out of the red. But I think cost certainty is a result of salary cap, salary disclosure, salary arbitration, and the rest of it that goes and the upper and lower limits of the salary cap have given us a sense of, or the industry a sense of what cost certainty means, because there's money above which you can't spend, money below which you can't not spend, and in between is the range of your opportunity to make money or break even or maybe lose a bet and maybe you're subject to revenue sharing. But cost certainty simply is the result of eliminating the old system and turning it into a knowable system that applies across all 32 teams, not just one or two or three.
If you'll indulge me going off on a tangent, you mentioned individual contract negotiations. Why is it that a lot of those negotiations take so long? Are there really that many nuances to it, or is there something else going on that makes them take weeks or sometimes even months?
Well, I think it depends on the individual contract. I mean, as you probably know, there's 5 different categories of players. There's players who are entry-level players, and they come in and they're restricted to a certain level of compensation and bonuses that control the amount they're going to pay. So those, and they get into kind of a slotting category. So you end up with first, second, third, fourth, fifth round picks and being signed at different levels, and they categorize them as entry-level players. That's really not anything that would drag out, unless like a Mario Lemieux or Eric Linder's situation where they're just not going to play for the team, or they're not going to play for the team that drafted them. Second category is the players who are entry-level, past entry-level, but not yet ready for arbitration. Those are the guys. The best example, like recent example, was the Nylander case in Toronto, where he held out for a long period of time because he was a restricted free agent, but not eligible for salary arbitration. So the club couldn't demand arbitration in his rights, whereas he played one more season, they could have demanded arbitration. So he sat out and had to go through the whole process. And then you get into the other arbitration level players where there's a pretty strong, how do I say this, organization of the process of negotiating contracts for players who have arbitration rights that can control the outcomes. And where you get the issues of extended negotiations, maybe not so much anymore because of the immediacy of it, is the unrestricted free agents. But I always say it seems that way because one example of a protracted salary negotiation gives the whole business of negotiating salary player contracts a sense that it's disruptive and drawn out. But it's usually high-profile players in special circumstances that bring that to the public eye. In my view, from what I have seen, I think that the process of negotiation of contracts, once you figure out your contract, your player need and your player expectations and where he fits on your team, it's not as complicated a process to get to the right number. But if the agent is reasonable, that's the hope and expectation. But in some cases, he's not reasonable.
You mentioned a moment ago revenue sharing. Without getting too technical, what are the mechanics of that?
Well, it's complicated as all get out. I mean, I could show you. We could put on the screen display the sections of the collective bargaining agreement that talk about this, and page upon page of expressions of numbers and throw in hockey related revenues. But basically the idea is that, and to try and simplify it, is that some teams do not have the ability to be a profitable enterprise even with the lower limit of the salaries being met. And I can't tell you the circumstances exactly now because I'm not close enough to the real details, but the idea that any team that is doing a good job in promoting its game in this local market, has a certain level of season ticket holders. They're doing a decent level of sponsorships, and the game is being accepted in the community. That's an indication of the good faith effort by that local ownership to do a good job in their community that might be a small market community. Hence the whole idea of the larger markets or a pool being created for revenue sharing that rewards clubs at that lower economic level of community support to remain profitable and operating in the league. And it just makes sense. I mean, it's you look at football. I mean, what is it, like the visiting team gets 40% of the gate revenues, whatever it may be. That's the home team's gate revenues. That's an example of revenue sharing, and I think it's a good example. But I think that if you have a 32-team league that's growing as dramatically as it has, both on the ice and off the ice, as the National Hockey League, revenue sharing is here to stay.
Here's a term that I understand, if it's possible, even less: escrow.
Oh boy, you're not the only one on that one. As I understand it, it came out of the last big confrontational negotiation that the players had an objective in terms of their share of total league revenues, and the league had an objective, and they weren't the same. So in order to make the deal, the players agreed that their contract value, I think at the time, 15% of it would be held back, and it would be put into a fund, and that fund would be available to the players based upon certain objectives being met by the league revenue standards. So if you say, for example, you had a $1 billion league revenue objective and the players were going to get 500 million, but it was only realistic to expect the league to have a 900 million rather than $1 billion, a certain amount of the players' money was held back pending the proof that it would get to the $1 billion level. That's a simplification, but that was the concept behind it. Basically was, we'll see if you're right. If you're not right, we don't have to pay you. So the escrow pool, I don't know where it is right now, but I think it's reached a fairly high level. I'm not sure if they've ever caught up, but I guess we could ask somebody at the league what they tell us. I don't know.
The newest wild card term is NIL, name, image, and likeness. We hear most about NIL and its impact on the amateur ranks. And Jerry, I know you're working on a legal model in this area. What can you share with us?
Well, the reason why I think it's relevant to this conversation is because it's an indication that the league and the associations that promote sports, hockey, football, all these kinds of things, have all undergone major transitions and major challenges to come up with a fair model. When we talk about the National Hockey League or other leagues that got salary caps or luxury caps and aggressive unions that pursue better conditions for their players, and certain markets have missed out on that. And I think the most egregious example of that was the U.S. college Division I athletic market. And it's just another indication that the sport as an institution is going through a corrective process. And it starts with the big leagues, and all of a sudden you end up with, in many cases, based upon a litigation model. And that's worth going into a little bit, because the guy that deserves some recognition, this whole thing, is a guy named Ed O'Bannon. Ed O'Bannon was, I think, the first person to sue the NCAA over being able to collect money from his own commercial value. And there was other cases along the way, but it took 7 years since the original O'Bannon case for the U.S. Supreme Court to declare that any rule by this is a simplification without getting into the formal legalities, but any rule that the NCAA imposed upon student athletes that restricted their rights to make a decent living out of their efforts beyond just their college tuition would be subject to scrutiny by the antitrust laws of the United States. The NCAA and the conference had operated in basically a protected zone for a long time, and all of the money that was generated by the games and TV rights and so on almost never went into the athletes' pockets. Not to mention the fact that in some circumstances, college athletes could lose their scholarship if they broke a leg and couldn't play football anymore, or if their grades weren't kept up to a standard. They did not have any sense of participating in the economic value they were presenting to the leagues or to the conferences and the teams and the schools. So the Supreme Court stepped in immediately within about, I'm going to say now, what it is now, about a year and a half, we've seen 30 states, including New York State, pass name, image, and likeness laws that require by law colleges and conferences to cooperate with their student athletes in the whole idea of making compensation, earning money off their name, image, and likeness, which is basically marketing power of their brand. And that marketing of power of their brand comes along with an obligation under these laws to provide a well-being or improved life circumstance effort for these college athletes. Health care after they leave if they're hurt. Career transition programs. Psychological training, career training. All those kinds of benefits have been imposed by law. So the athletes are now getting their first shake at the college level.
What are the ramifications for Canadian junior hockey if going the college route and maybe taking advantage of name, image, and likeness becomes more appealing, as you would imagine it would, for young hockey players?
Well, I think it could ending up in the Canadian Hockey League too. It's a different program, and I'm not aware of what they're doing with career transition and player empowerment, but that's something that's very important. And I think this player empowerment idea is that, there's 500,000 Division I athletes in the United States, and I think the statistics show that 1% of them will play a game in pro hockey, or pro sports rather. So you've got that going on where you've got, 99% of all the players who break legs and get their heads banged and, produce a product for the schools and the conferences, come out of it with an education, which is important. Hopefully most of them do, but not all do. And with some level of move on in life, but they don't have the life skills that they deserve to get as part of their education, especially in that situation where they're earning money for their schools. It could end up, it may even be going on in Canadian junior hockey. I know that there are obligations league-wide that clubs can no longer abdicate responsibility for educating their kids, and they have a right to get college completion education funds if they don't turn pro and sign a pro contract or play a certain number of pro games. So this NIL or name, image, and likeness thing is almost like, okay, we've dealt with the big leagues, we've got collective bargaining, player benefits are good. Where do we go next to solve a problem that's unique? And who's going to feel sorry for a National Hockey League player, a basketball NBA player, an MLB player who appears to be making millions of dollars in their lifetime? How can we feel bad about that? But people forget that a very small percentage of pro athletes, usually well-established roster players, will make enough money to last their lifetime. The rest of them who don't become what I call clear roster players, which represents at least a third or more of the players that aspire to pro careers, will not come out of it with any kind of economic security. And this is I think we're seeing this enlightenment program filter down into the amateur ranks now too, which is a great thing.
I agree with you because even these athletes who never turn pro, they have been taken care of in the sense that they haven't had to develop life skills necessarily in high school or maybe in college that the rest of us did by necessity. And all of a sudden, once the career is over and the people who have managed their careers are done with them, they're thrown out on the street, as you say, without those life skills or ways to keep themselves financially afloat.
Well, I think it's time for a shout out to another group that's done a tremendous job of creating programs for these players. The American Hockey League and the East Coast Hockey League are the feeder development leagues for the National Hockey League. And there's an organization called the Professional Hockey Players Association that's led by Larry Landon. And they've created a transition program, a career transition program, which I'm very much involved in because we're creating academic programs with their assistance for players who come out of their minor pro careers on an NHL chance, and they can get some learning on working in the pro sports world. But the idea here, under he and Steve Carney, they've created this transition program that kind of fills the gap between the college ranks, the junior ranks, and it goes through the minor pros and hopefully into the NHL. And I would expect that the next level of resolution here will be something done at the NHL level and the PA level and maybe even the Alumni Association. Glenn Healy and Wendy McCreary at the NHL Alumni Association are doing great work in creating programs. And I think we need to recognize that regardless of the fact that people will end up with some level of an NHL career, there's still a fairly large group that come out of it with just enough money to get by for a few years. And then what do I do with the rest of my life? And I think that's kind of like the things will come full circle. We'll now have the amateur world, minor pro world satisfied and into the major league ranks, and we'll see a much happier group of retired players when it comes to that than maybe we've had in the past.
And with any luck, we'll be getting in touch with Larry Landon and have him expand on those things that you rightly applauded him for on a future Hockey Time Machine. To close this show, as much as I know you dislike speculating, I'm going to ask you to speculate.
All right, here we go.
And you have touched on it, but what's your best guess about the chances of labor management peace in the NHL in the long run going forward?
Well, I think it's reached a level of maturity that one recognizes that they can't get along without the other. And there's two ways to do it. One is to cooperate and be creative in solving issues that might come up, and the other is to fight over it constantly. The fighting of unions and ownership in the pro sports is somewhat tiresome. I think it turns the fans off. I think it sends the wrong message to people who are supporting it that, why should we support people who can't get along? And I think that the long-term objective or outcome or reality is that status quo with tweaks here and there are going to be dealt with in a creative, cooperative fashion. I mean, you look at some of the things that we've talked about in the past, the salary cap. Is the salary cap perfect? Is the draft perfect? Is the anything healthcare perfect? Are the pensions perfect? Is the transition program the right one? These things are going to come up all the time. But I don't think, this is my speculation now, I don't think under the current leadership on either side that there's any stomach or a large stomach in pro sports for any more high-profile battles in front of the public, that there's a really strong undercurrent or back door or back room kind of dialogue going on constantly. And in fact, in the NHL, there is a committee that works on dealing with these issues between collective bargaining deadlines that were sorted out before it even gets to a crisis point.
Jerry, you have once again gifted us a master class. The game we see on the ice and on TV is is the Ferrari, but you've taken us under the hood with the engine, the transmission, and all the things that without which that shiny new car wouldn't run. So it's been fascinating, and you've made it interesting and understandable. And we thank you so much for that. And anybody who's listening, once Jerry offers these classes and these programs, run, don't walk to sign up, because you've really done a fantastic job.
Well, let me say one last thing about that. Thank you for that introduction, but my colleagues at the University of Buffalo Law School and Engineering School are committed to continuing to build these programs for the benefit of athletes, non-athletes, and anybody who wants to understand what the pro world is all about. And my big goal in academics was been, much as I love the scholarly approach to it, the real world says teach them how to work and what to think. And that's what we tried to accomplish here, I think, with your group. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to express these things.
Well, I think we're all better for it. The more we know, the more we understand, I think the better we can appreciate the game that we love.
Well, it's being played at a very high level right now in a lot of places, so it looks like it's all working. And you guys have added a real dimension to the dialogue by having this focus, Hockey Time Machine. So thank you for that.
All right, Jerry, I am sure we'll talk again and we'll have you on again. But for now, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Glenn, and best to everybody there.
All right, and thank you for those of you watching, and we'll see you next time on Hockey Time Machine.